that we have to maintain within a particular range of the what point. And you guys know if we have a deviation from the set point, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we have a word for that. We call it what? Stress. And so what happens, of course, in order to maintain health, if I have a deviation from the set point, I need to bring it back up to the set point. And so what's going to be out there is I'm going to have some sort of a what, everybody? Right, receptor. Say receptor. Okay? And the receptor is going to pick up, particular type of stress. It could be high blood pressure, low blood pressure, low oxygen carrying capacity. It could be body temperature. There's just, blood glucose levels, all sorts of receptors, chemoreceptors, osmoreceptors. So we talked about so many of these things over 2 semesters. So whatever it is, the receptor is going to pick up that information and convey it via what pathway? Afferent pathway to a what center? And then the control center is going to be the control center is going to be looking at that information, comparing it to a genetically predetermined what point? Set point. Okay, the genes will determine that. And if we do have a deviation, then what's going to happen is the control center is then going to be sending some information via what pathway? Afferent pathway to some sort of a what? Say effector. Effector. And the effector is going to do something, or in other words, it's going to have some sort of a what? Effect. The effect, of course, is to what? Restore homeostasis. Okay, and of course, we're dealing with a negative feedback system here. So in AMP1, we took a good look at the nervous system. And in the nervous system, of course, the control center was, dealing with neurons. The afferent and efferent pathway were dealing with neurons and nerves and that sort of a thing, cranial nerves, whatever. And but now what we're going to do is we're going to look at another aspect of this, where the communication is not going to be nerve impulses, but it's going to be chemical messengers. And the chemical messengers are called hormones. Alrighty? And so in that particular case, what happens is that you're going to see oftentimes the afferent and the efferent pathway is not going to be nerves, it's going to be the bloodstream. And what's going to be transporting in the bloodstream are these chemical messengers that will now communicate between, receptors and effectors or whatever. So far, so good? Okay. And so what happens, of course, is these hormones tend to be very, very specific. And so once if the control center secretes, for example, if the pancreas secretes insulin, okay, the insulin goes into the bloodstream. We've talked about that in AMP1. And then eventually it's going to go to some sort of an effector. And of course, in AMP1, it was the liver. You might remember that was your very first lecture. If you don't remember, don't worry about it. What the liver is going to have is going to have special insulin receptors. Special what, everybody? Insulin. And what we notice is that those receptors are highly specific. And so the particular tissue that has those receptors, we would call that the target tissue or the target organ. Okay? And again, these are highly specific receptors for very specific hormones. This is a highly specific system. So far, so good? So basic functions is, of course, when we're dealing with a negative feedback system like this, of course, it's to maintain homeostasis, to keep all the physiological variables within a narrow range of the set point. Has regulatory functions, so for example, growth. AMP1, we talked a little bit about this, but little Johnny's growing like a freaking weed, isn't he? And so that's controlled by my hypothalamus. And so what will be secreted is a hormone called growth hormone. We'll talk about that tonight a little bit more. Reproductive matters, and again, so much of that, which you guys saw with the male reproductive, and again, you're going to see as you continue with the female reproductive system, but those are driven by hormones, okay, and that's really important. So far, so good? All righty, look on your sheet, and let's talk a little about the chemistry of some of these hormones, and what we have is a lot of classifications And you ought to appreciate this because you'll be dealing with, in pharmacology, you're going to be dealing with glycoprotein steroids, protein hormones. There's all sorts of different types of proteins. And depending on what the classification of the molecule is, it may be that you cannot ingest it. Sometimes you can ingest it. But if you can't ingest it, for example, if you have a hormone such as insulin, which is a protein, I can't take that orally because it's going to enter into the stomach. And of course, what is the function of the stomach? Is to begin to break down proteins. You guys follow? And so that's impossible. We'll destroy the hormone. So what we have to do is have to go bypass the digestive tract and we put it directly into the arm. You guys see it in the bloodstream. So the first classification is steroids. Okay, and steroids are lipids, and they are lipid soluble. They are not water soluble. And what we find is that we have one particular steroid that is so important for cell structure and function, which is called what? Cholesterol. Okay, and we've talked about this in times past, but our body makes a full gram of cholesterol every day. Very important in terms of cell structure. But cholesterol has some other functions as well, because what the body can do with cholesterol is it can take that molecule, and you have an illustration there in your notes, and it can tweak it, it can modify it, it can change some of the side groups to start making other types of steroids, and these will be hormones. And so, for example, we talk a little bit, with aldosterone in the urinary system, but aldosterone, everybody, is a steroid, and where it's the cells that make the aldosterone, it doesn't make it from the ground up. What it's going to do is it's going to take cholesterol, and there'll be a metabolic pathway to eventually make that into aldosterone. Okay. Another example is cortisol. If you have hives or you've got some sort of inflammation on your skin, sometimes what we'll put some of these cortisols, on our skin in these creams, and what that does is just it dampens an immune response. You guys follow that those are steroids. Another one are amines, and so when you have an amine, what that is a modification of an amino acid. Okay, and so what you can see there in your handout. Do you have the handout there? Oh, good. We want your handouts this time. Right. Okay.
The outline or the handout?
Say what?
Outline or?
Yeah, you guys should just work to sit together.
Outline or the handout?
Both. Yeah, he's using He's using his computer, but he's. And so there in your notes, you can see your basic amino acid, and you can see you have an amino group. You've got the acid group. And what happens, of course, is I can make all sorts of amino acids from this basic skeletal structure. And a really important amino acid there is tyrosine. It's what, everybody? Tyrosine. And tyrosine is a basic amino acid that we use for making proteins. But what we also have are metabolic pathways that can now take the tyrosine and tweak it or modify it, adjust it, so I can now get epinephrine and norepinephrine. So that would be considered an amine. Okay. The next one is peptides. And you guys might remember from the digestive tract that when the boli go into the stomach, the pepsinogen, which is converted into pepsin, begins to just sort of go snip, 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 cutting up all those the proteins into these little peptides segments. And so when I'm dealing with a peptide, I'm dealing with a very small protein segment. And two good examples of this is antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. These are peptides. They are what tides, everybody? Peptides. And that's good, 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 good. And the protein, I have that grade on your sheet, don't I? Do I have a grade on your sheet? Yeah, I do. Our protein will be insulin. glycoproteins or proteins, just a few of those that would have be protein with some carbohydrates that are attached. Okay, so far so good? All right, feedback system. So what I just showed you right here is this is what we call a negative feedback system. Because what happens when I have a deviation from the set point, what happens, something is going to be occur that is going to negate the stress. And when you have something that negates the stress, I would call that a what feedback system? Negative feedback system. Okay, and so we've got some good examples of this, and one good example is tyrosine and metabolic rate. Let's see what I've got here. So what I want you guys to do is pull out your endocrine pathways handout. This is a big one. Okay, see what? That's nice. Okay, and page 4, I have the example of this. And listen, about your exam, oftentimes what I do is I have people just illustrate a lot of these illustrations. I'm not going to have you do that. You guys are going to be doing the female reproductive illustration and guided essay. But I'm not going to have you draw all these, but you want to, you're going to see the lecture I'm going to be giving you in great part is represented by these images. So this is going to be an important study tool for you. Alrighty? And so right here on page 4, you have an example of a negative feedback system. And what happens is this. What I'm looking at here is the metabolic rate. And you guys know when you sleep, and we've sort of talked about this before, but when you sleep, does your metabolism just stop? No, but it does go a little bit slower. And so what we know is that our metabolism is affected by a very important hormone. This is like putting your foot to the pedal to the metal, but this is tyrosine and triiodothyronine. You can sort of see them right there. And so the way this negative feedback system works is this. I'm going to put 2 graphs up here, okay? And so right here I've got my, let's say this is my basal metabolic rate. And then right here, I'm going to have my relative concentrations of these hormones, T3 and T4, which stands for thyroxine and triiodothyronine. And what I know is if the hormone concentrations go up, then what happens is the basal metabolic rate goes up. You guys see? When the hormone concentration in the bloodstream goes down, the basal metabolic rate goes down. When the hormones go below the set point, what I notice my basal metabolic rate goes below the what point? And I'm starting to feel a little bit lethargic, like I need a cup of coffee or something or whatever. And then what's going to happen, the negative feedback system needs to negate the stress. And so what it's going to do is going to start secreting these hormones into the bloodstream, bringing it back up to the what point, everybody? Sure, so the set point. So what happens, this is sort of an interesting negative feedback system, because the goal here is monitoring the basal metabolic, is adjusting the basal metabolic rate. But what the control center does is it doesn't measure the basal metabolic rate, it simply measures the concentration of these hormones, because the hormones are a reflection of what the basal metabolic rate works. So what happens here again? So at the bottom right-hand page of page 4, you can see there's the increase in the basal metabolic rate as thyroxine and triiodothyronine goes up. But as it goes up, what's going to happen is going to have an effect on the hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus is controlling the basal metabolic rate. So far, so good? Okay. And so what happens is this, is in your hypothalamus, we're going to have this hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, okay? And so what will happen is that if these concentrations go up, that's going to have a negative effect on the system, on this negative feedback system. So what the hypothalamus begins to do is it now begins to secrete less thyrotropin releasing hormone. So let's just go over this. But when you see the word tropin, what tropin means is that it affects another endocrine gland. A tropic hormone affects another endocrine gland. A tropic hormone affects another endocrine gland. Now, this particular hormone, TRH here, what it's going to do is it's going to affect your thyroid gland. So I'm going to call this thyrotropin releasing hormone. The thyrotropin releasing hormone is going to go in through the fenestrations into my hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. It now comes in contact with the anterior pituitary gland. Are you with me? And once it comes in contact with the anterior pituitary gland, now it's going to secrete another hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone. What do you think thyroid stimulating hormone is going to do? Stimulate the thyroid gland. And so now that goes to the fenestration. So thyroid stimulating hormone is now into the bloodstream. Now it comes in contact with the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland now responds by secreting thyroxine and triiodothyronine. The result is the concentrations of these hormones goes up, okay? And then the result is my basal metabolic rate goes up, okay? And so there's an illustration of that, and so that's the way it is. So when the concentrations go up, it'll have a negative effect. When the concentrations go down, it will allow the system to work, okay? The other one is a positive feedback system, and I guess it's worth mentioning that right now. But when I have a negative feedback system, what happens when I have a deviation from the set point, something happens to bring the system back to the set point. But in a positive feedback system, it's a little bit different. What happens, I've got this measurement, which we're just simply going to call stasis. We're going to call it what, everybody? Stasis. And what happens is that if I have a deviation from stasis, what will happen, that deviation from stasis will be picked up by some receptor, will convey it to a particular control center. It's going to then communicate to a particular effector, and the effect will be to enhance the deviation. You guys see? Alrighty, and so the result is going to be an enhanced deviation, and then the result is now the receptor picks that up, conveys it via afferent pathway to the control center. The control center sees that, gee, we're way off, and we're giving enhanced deviation, and now it sends some more hormone to a particular effector. The effect is to further enhance the deviation. Do you guys see? So a positive feedback system is a build-up system. And as it goes, it builds, until all of a sudden something pops. And what happens is that I'm going to reach a particular threshold. And once it hits that threshold, some physiological event occurs. And then I go right back down to stasis. No partial credit for that one. To what, everybody? To stasis. No more Mr. Nice Guy. Okay. And of course, the illustration, we did this in A and B1. Do you guys remember this? Maureen, if you could hit the lights. Thank you. Is that clock right?
Yeah.
I gotta check you guys. I've heard from the last couple of times. That left early. Yeah, a few times. I was looking at the clock up in the lab. That's not right. You said, yeah, you guys left early.
What day was that?
I don't know. Too many.
Oh,
I think I went twice.
I wasn't here.
Nobody said a word. No one said anything. At any rate, so childbirth is a good example of this. You were early?
I wouldn't work in the left class, most people work like I used to. So, I don't know.
All right, well, you owe me. All right, at any rate, what happens is, the uterus, of course, is going to be filled up with baby, and it's going to become a certain point where baby needs to be kicked out, right? And so we talk a little bit about that. And it's going to come a point where that child gets so big that there is going to be a system now that is going to cause that myometrium to begin to contract. And the control center, of course, here is going to be my what I miss, hypothalamus. Now, in this particular case, when I did with T3 and T4, that was the anterior pituitary gland. That was the what, everybody? The anterior pituitary gland always uses that hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, period. Okay? But right here, I'm dealing with the posterior pituitary gland. And we dealt with this a little bit, particularly when we're with the urinary system. But what I'm going to have here is some special cells here, which I'm going to call, does anybody remember, because it was on your exam? Good, neurosecretory cells. Neurosecretory. No. No, your last exam. You got it wrong, don't worry.
No.
And so what's going to happen is the neurosecretory cells, guys, they are sort of like neurons, okay? And so they will depolarize, and then they can send an impulse and conduct an impulse. Now, you guys know when you do the nervous system, you'll eventually get to a synaptic end bulb. Do you guys remember that? And then what will happen is you will exocytose, acetylcholine or some sort of other neurotransmitter into a synaptic cleft. You guys remember? All right? But in this case, when I'm dealing with the neurosecretory cell, everything is the same, except when the synaptic end bulb exocytoses that chemical messenger, it doesn't go into a synaptic cleft, it goes into the bloodstream. No, that's not the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. And so it'll immediately go through the fenestrations, and now it's in the bloodstream. And in this particular case, the hormone is oxytocin. And so the urinary system is ADH. Okay, and that was those are actually the only two hormones that use that system. It's oxytocin and ADH. They'll use the neurosecretory cells. And so the result is oxytocin comes in contact with the uterus, and the uterus now begins to what, everybody? Contract. And then my stretch receptors stretch even more. And now my neurosecretory cells from the hypothalamus secretes even more oxytocin. And now there's more contractions. And you can see it's building, 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 building. And of course you're dilating at this point until all of a sudden you hit a little what hole? Threshold, and pop, the baby pops out. Say what?
So I thought ADH was secreted from the anterior pituitary.
Posterior.
ADH and thyroid hormone.
Yeah.
I thought it was anterior.
No. Guys, let's have a positive feedback system. Okay, so that's a good example. That's a review from AMP1, so that's convenient. Okay, so next. Mechanisms of hormonal control. You guys should learn this. It's not a lot of fun, actually, but sort of important. I'll just explain it to you right now. So there's actually several mechanisms for hormonal control. And one of them is called the fixed membrane receptor mechanism. And this always deals with water-soluble hormones. So that would be, amines, proteins, glycoproteins, so on and so forth. They could all conceivably use the fixed membrane receptor mechanism. And then I'm going to have a mobile receptor mechanism that will deal with steroidal hormones. Okay, so that could be, estrogens, aldosterone, cortisol, what are some of the others? Testosterone, so on and so forth. All of those are steroids. Now, if the way this works is, here I've got this chemical messenger, this steroid, and the goal here is that the hormone needs to come in contact with a target tissue or a target cell. And of course, when a target cell is going to be doing some sort of work, the apparatus for dealing with that is going to occur inside the cell. So what happens, since it's water soluble, no problem transporting because it will dissolve in the universal solvent called water. And so it's in the plasma, it gets into the interstitial fluids, and now it comes in contact with this particular cell. But I've got a problem. What I have here is I've got a phospholipid bilayer, and you guys remember this is hydrophilic, hydrophobic, hydrophilic. Hydrophilic, hydrophobic tails, so fatty acid tails, hydrophilic. And the issue here is my water-soluble hormone will not dissolve in those lipid tails. So it cannot enter into the cell to have some sort of an effect. So the way this will work is that it's going to have a particular receptor on the cell surface. And the way this particular one works is it is going to take, once the hormone attaches to the receptor, that will enzymatically convert an ATP molecule into an AMP molecule. Okay? And it has a cyclical form, they call it cyclic AMP. Now, in this case, we're going to call it cyclic AMP as the secondary messenger. Okay? And there are a lot of these water-soluble hormones. And the secondary messenger is always cyclic AMP. It's always cyclic AMP. And so what happens, now there's going to be all sorts of unique hormones. You can have some that are, we could just sort of, there's circles, or triangles, or squares, or whatever. They all have these unique, shapes. And these particular receptors are going to be specific for that particular hormone. Do you guys see? So if I have a hormone that looks like this, sort of square, are you with me? Okay. So that would dissolve, not shown here, it would dissolve in the plasma, into the interstitial fluids, but it wouldn't bind to that receptor. Yes or no? No, because this does a round molecule. I just drew a square molecule. So the result is cyclic AMP is not elevated. Cyclic AMP is not elevated. It's going to have no effect. But let's say I now secrete this molecule. That's the one that's depicted. Okay, it's a different hormone, just a completely different water-soluble hormone. Now, it does dissolve in the plasma. It does dissolve in the interstitial fluids. But now I have a receptor that will bind to that, you guys see, and then very quickly it now begins to take ATP and make cyclic AMP. And the concentration of cyclic AMP goes up. As cyclic AMP goes up, what happens is it begins to catalyze a cascade of reactions. And so what happens, an enzyme is activated, and it activates another enzyme and another one. And as this cascade goes on, eventually what happens is whatever that cell is supposed to do, it does it at a greater rate. Whatever that cell does, it does it at a greater rate. Okay? And the result is that homeostasis would be restored. Does that make sense? Ready? And so again, you have all these different hormones that are water soluble, but in all cases, the secondary messenger is the same. It's always the same. So what's the difference is the different receptors and the different hormones need to combine correctly. And then cyclic AMP goes up and I'll have an altered cell function. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Alrighty. When you, the reason that this will be sort of important, and I've seen this, it's not a bad idea to get into the habit, particularly once you get through microbiology, and this course too. When you get a medication, but you guys know you get the medication, you get this piece of paper that's really long, you know what I'm talking about, or it's folded 100 times, and you can just unfold it, whatever. But when you read that, it will always tell you the mechanism by which the drug works. Okay, and it will rehearse this for you. Okay, it's in there. Okay, so far so good. So you would see this for sure. Okay, so the next one is going to be dealing with steroids in particular. Okay, ones that are water insoluble. And you guys remember from the male reproductive system, what we had those interstitial endocrinocytes. Not the interstitial, but the sustentacular cells that secreted an androgen binding protein. You guys remember that? And so why did they do that? It was a protein, but what the protein, of course, does dissolve in water. But my interstitial endocrinocytes would produce a steroid hormone called what? Testosterone. And testosterone does not dissolve in water. So what will happen is the androgen binding protein will bind to the testosterone, and now that will piggyback that hormone in the water-based system. Okay? And so that's what's happening here is I have a fat-soluble or a lipid-type hormone, and so there's always going to be some sort of a carrier molecule to sort of transport it in the water-based system. And so what happens, it does carry it through, and then eventually it comes in contact with my phospholipid bilayer. Now what I note, this is a steroid hormone, and here's my fatty acids. So would the steroid hormone dissolve into fatty acid tails? Yes or no? Yes, it would. And so it does. And so there it is. And so now it's inside that phospholipid bilayer. Now what I have to do is I have to get it inside the cell. So problem. Inside the cell, the cytoplasm is what based? It's water based. So again, what I need to do, once it's inside the cell membrane, now I need to get it out of the cell membrane and transport it into the cell. And so yet again, right here, see, I have another receptor. And so now that receptor picks up that hormone, and there it is. So now I have another, they're two different receptors, but they're carrying the same hormone. And the way this works is this. It can affect metabolic pathways, but it's going to do it in this manner. The receptor steroid combination will enter into the nucleus. Okay? And you guys remember you've got your DNA here that's divided up into these functional units called genes. Okay? And each gene codes for a protein, which could be an enzyme or whatever. All right? And so what happens is the hormone receptor combo enters in and it stimulates the transcription of DNA into messenger RNA or an RNA transcript. Once I get my messenger RNA, it now goes into the cytoplasm. And there I have my whatosomes, ribosomes, and the ribosomes now do the process of translation. And what it's going to translate, of course, could be enzymes. Okay? And the result is a metabolic pathway will go at a faster rate. Or it could be a structural protein, or it could be something else that's going on, but I'm now going to have an altered cell function. In other words, whatever that cell does, it's now going to do it at a greater rate. You guys follow? Okay. So those are the two biggies, right? Those are the two big mechanisms. You guys all set with that? Right. Oi. Posterior pituitary gland. I'm going to show you guys something. Oh, I'm looking for a particular image which I know will be helpful to you. And I think this is it. This makes it real simple. Yeah, this is nice. If I can get it. Try one more time.
You just copy that and put it into the Word.
I don't want to do this. Open. Open in the window. Oops. Lost it. Shoot. You guys see that okay? Thanks. Okay, good. So, what we're going to do is we're going to start talking a little bit more about the pituitary gland, which of course resides in the sella turcica, okay, of this sphenoid bone. And what's sort of important to note, everybody, is the pituitary gland is not one gland, it's two glands. It is two glands, and they have two totally different developmental origins, okay? And the result is they're completely separate glands, they're together, so sometimes we just like to just call it the pituitary gland. And what we do have here is we have a posterior lobe and I have an anterior lobe. So when I'm dealing with this anterior lobe, everybody, that's going to be my hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. And of course, what will happen is, and you might recall because we have talked about this before, but the hypothalamus is the control center, and then what it's going to do is going to secrete some releasing hormones or other hormones. We'll talk about that. And they'll go in through the fenestrations, through the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vein, come in contact with the anterior lobe, and then it now is going to produce a particular hormone, and then off it goes. Do you guys see it? But the posterior lobe is different, and what's going to happen here? You can see you have blood supply, but it's just your regular capillary bed. It'll be fenestrated. And but what I'm going to use and employ in this case, instead of releasing hormones, I'm going to be using neurosecretory cells. Okay, and so what will happen? The control centers are up here. The cell bodies of these neurosecretory cells will be in the control centers, and these neurons now, of course, will be part of my efferent pathway. And what they will do upon stimulation is secrete the hormone into the bloodstream, and then off it goes. Okay. So again, the only two hormones that the posterior lobe deals with is what? ADH and oxytocin. Those are the only two, and we're going to talk about those right now, a little bit, maybe. All right. So the first one here is the posterior lobe. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the anterior lobe. That'll be a little bit more time. Okay, so I want you guys to grab your handout and turn to page 6. Okay. Can you guys see that okay? Maybe we don't have to flip the lights on. You guys are all set with everything? All right, so we've dealt with ADH, and of course you guys know that in the hypothalamus we're going to have what receptors? Right, osmoreceptors. We're going to have what receptors, everybody? You get that one right. Maybe. And of course, what are those osmoreceptors doing? They are measuring the relative concentration of both salt and water. Okay? And so if water goes up, salt goes down, we're going to have a more hypotonic condition. But if salt goes up and water goes down, then we're going to have a more what? Hypertonic condition. When you have a hypertonic condition, what I want to do is I don't want to lose water. But if I have a hypotonic condition, I do want to lose water. And so what happens is this. If we have a hypotonic condition, if we have a hypertonic condition, what we want to do is we don't want to lose water. And so the result is the neurosecretory cells now are going to secrete antidiuretic hormone. You guys see? And so it goes into the bloodstream and then eventually goes to my kidneys. And of course, what the kidneys start doing in order to, to improve this situation and bring it back to the set point, the kidneys, the collecting duct and the distal convoluted tube starts making what aquaporins? Aquaporins. Okay? And those aquaporins just start spontaneously embedding in that those collecting ducts. And now, as the urine, because at this point I can't call it urine, as the urine begins to go through the collecting ducts, does it see the salty medulla? Yeah. Yes, it does. And the result is it pulls in water by what? Osmosis. And at the same time, of course, as this is happening, my hypothalamus, when we talked about this, also stimulates what? Thirst. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go seek out and search for water, and we'll ingest that. Okay? And then, of course, it's going to have to, it's going to begin the process of restoring homeostasis. But again, I'm dealing now with water issues, and so it also makes sense that ADH not only is going to create the aquaporins to hold on to water, but it doesn't surprise us that from our sweat glands, it's going to cause them to sweat what? Less, so I lose less water. Okay. And then the other thing is this. You guys remember we talked about the urinary system and we looked at two types of regulation. We dealt with blood pressure and I dealt with water salt concentration. Do you guys remember? Okay, we looked at those two regulatory issues. The reality is the two of them are holding hands quite tightly. Do you guys follow? Because one will affect the other will affect back and forth. And so if you're having a blood pressure issue, you're probably having a water salt balance issue as well. If you're having water salt balance issue, you're probably having a blood pressure issue as well. And so all these systems sort of work synergistically. And so if I'm dealing with some water issues and there's not enough water, that also lets me know that perhaps my blood pressure is going down. And the result is ADH will cause your blood vessels to begin to vasoconstrict to help the process of raising blood pressure. Alrighty? And again, that'll be a negative feedback system. As I hold on to the water and begin getting a more hypotonic condition, that will have a negative effect. And the result is there'll be less ADH that's secreted. Okay? So it's also visually. So just need to walk through that, and that'd be good. All right. Okay. Next is oxytocin. I did that one already. I'm not going to do it again. Is that okay? So we did that on page 5. Now, posterior pituitary gland. I see anterior pituitary gland. So what's going to happen here is this. And I'm going to actually expand it a little bit more from what we talked about in the past. But I've got these two capillary beds that are connected by a portal vein. Okay, they're coloring it red. I can't talk about. I don't know why that's the case, but it's a portal vein. Okay, it should probably be more of a purple color. And of course the capillaries are going to be fenestrated. And so what will happen is the anterior lobe is going to secrete certain hormones. But in order for it to secrete hormones, it needs a chemical messenger to induce that. What is going to produce the chemical messenger to induce it is going to be my hypothalamus. And so there's going to be two classifications of hormones that the hypothalamus can secrete. They will be releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. Releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. And so what will happen, the hypothalamus is going to secrete both at the same time. It's going to secrete both at the same time. But what will happen if the releasing hormone concentration is secreted at a greater rate than the inhibiting hormone? Then what will happen is this anterior pituitary is going to secrete more of a particular hormone. But if the inhibiting hormone secretion exceeds the releasing hormone secretion, then the anterior lobe is going to secrete less of a particular hormone. You guys see? Okay? And so the example of this is going to be growth hormone. I think that's the one I have on page 7 for you guys. Oh wait, hold on. Yeah. Actually, there's one more thing I want to talk about. And that is this. I actually sort of talked about it, but I got a diagram to illustrate. Alrighty. So what I have here is another classification scheme. I dealt with a chemical classification and a functional classification. And I've already mentioned these terms, but the illustration here is far better. And so the typical thing that we think about is you have an endocrine gland, and it secretes a hormone. It comes in contact with the target tissue, and the target tissue responds, right? Okay, insulin, bloodstream, liver, we store glucose as glycogen. When that's the case, we'll call it a non-tropic hormone. We will call it a non-tropic hormone. But there's another very common scenario where an endocrine gland is going to secrete a hormone, but the hormone is not going to go to the target tissue, it's going to go to another endocrine gland. So when you have a hormone that is going to another endocrine gland, I'm going to call that a tropic hormone. Okay? And then this endocrine gland is going to have some sort of response. It's going to secrete something that will come in contact with the target tissue, and there'll be a response. Okay? So now what we're dealing with is, and by the way, when you dealt with the male and the female system, you were dealing with a lot of tropic hormones. Do you guys follow? And gonadotropin, that was a tropic hormone, releasing hormone. Alrighty, so you've been dealing with it, and I'm not going to be dealing with those again because we've dealt with them. So the first one I want to deal with is the two non-tropic hormones. These are, of course, the easy ones. Okay. And so turn to page 7. I'll keep this up and turn to page 7. That outline is just detailing the illustration. The way these handouts evolved, when I first started teaching, I had none of this. I just took really good notes and hope you got it all. You would have hated it. I think so. Maybe. We'll see. I don't know. Then I started doing the outlines. Students like that. They like that quite a bit. I let them read tape. We had tape recorders back then. They like that as well. And then as I continued doing stuff on the board, then it starts turning into pictures. And so this is a slow development. And a couple of years I'll be retiring, and at that point I'm ready to start teaching, but it's too late. Right? Sort of like raising kids. Say what?
You're retiring?
I hope not. Well, I'm 16. 62. I'm either 62 or 63. I think I'm 62, and I'll be 63 shortly. So it's a couple of years, probably. Say what? Say it. For fun, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. As long as I can, I'll be teaching for fun, but not as much as I do right now. Sort of like raising kids. Raising kids. You know, when you're doing it the first time, you're messing up all the time. Okay, and when you're all done, you guys were parents, probably. Well, you probably are in the midst of it, but when you're all done, you will know how to do it, right? But at that point, it's too late. They're gone. Is that not right? Is that right? Anybody?
I am way better at parenting my third child than I was with my first.
Oh yeah.
Oh, he's better when my first is better behaved. I'm tired of it now.
All right, you guys, let's do it. So look at page 7. And so, and we talked a lot about this in A&P1. You remember bone growth, little Johnny growing like a freaking weed, and growth hormones. You know, we talked about this. And so the what is actually going to regulate this, of course, is the hypothalamus. That regulates growth. And there's going to be 2 hormones that the hypothalamus secretes: growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. It's written right there. And again, when you're dealing with these endocrine glands, they never just turn on or off. It's always just a matter of degree. Okay? And so what will happen if growth hormone releasing hormone concentration goes up and growth hormone inhibiting concentration goes down, then the pituitary glands are going to start secreting more what? Growth hormone. Okay, human growth hormone. That's going to have 4 effects. A&P1, we only dealt with 1. Okay. So we'll review that. But at any rate, number 1, you guys remember that as little Johnny is growing, his humerus, or Janie's little humerus, that actually consists of what? 3 bony parts connected by 2 hyaline cartilage growth plates. Do you guys see? And if you recall from way back when, what maintains that growth plate is human growth hormone. And of course, what will happen is that, you know, as the child is growing, you're going to have these growth spurts. And so when there's more growth hormone, there's a growth spurt. When there's less growth hormone, we're out of the growth spurt. And so the first thing that it does is growth hormone maintains the growth plate and causes those cells to proliferate. Okay? And so you're going to get that whole growth process. The next thing is this. When you're growing, guys, that takes a lot of energy. You need a lot of ATP. Okay? And of course, you guys know protein or carbohydrate gives me how much energy per gram? 4 kilocalories. But lipid gives me what? 9. More than twice the energy. Okay, more than twice the ATP. And so what's going to happen, you can see here, you know, as we're starting to work down there, I'm looking at some triglycerides, and what growth hormone will do, it'll begin to break those down, and I'll feed them into what? Beta oxidation. And the result is we went through that with the liver and the heart twice, but what I'll start doing is with beta oxidation, you know, I'm just going to be breaking that down in these little acetyl groups. You guys remember? Feeding it into the chromosome, getting a lot of electrons, and making lots of what TP? ATP, lots of ATP. And you guys know, if you have a little kid, you know, some of these kids, when I was a teenager, I ate like a pig. I mean, a huge quantities of food on a daily basis, and I was stuffed. I could not get fat. Okay, and that's the way it is. And then all of a sudden, of course, life changes, right? And now I'm so used to eating a lot of food, but now what happens? I don't burn it off, and I have a what? I've got a midlife crisis right there, right? No, I see. Say what? Success story. That's not a success. That's a tragedy. Oh boy. You have a pot belly? You have a beer belly. You have beer belly. No. Say what?
I have a 29-inch waist.
First does.
Oh, enjoy it while it lasts. I've got a 36-inch waist, and it's not going anymore. It's going back down to what it should be like. I think I've always used to be like 30, 32-ish. But I was never that thin. At any rate, when you're growing, of course, say what?
No, I just said I have some beads you can borrow if you need some new clothes. We were talking about clothes shopping down there. Maybe
Okay.
little skinny.
But you might look cute in it, James. Let's try it out. Listen, if you're growing, yeah, you need ATP to make the enzymes and all that stuff. But realize, when you are growing, what you're doing is you are making a lot of protein, because our primary structure is a whole lot of protein. And so what that also does, it enhances amino acid uptake, so I can make, a lot of collagen or whatever else is needed for the growth process. And then, finally, is this. You guys remember, this is your very first lecture in AMP1. But you guys remember metabolism, the sum total of all the biochemical reactions that occur in the body. You guys remember? And of course, we can divide that up into two. There are anabolic reactions and catabolic reactions. And so if the buildup and the breakdown reactions are going at the same rate, well, I'm going to be maintaining my structure and my weight. But if anabolic exceeds catabolic, I'm going to be making more structure, and I'll probably could be gaining weight. And likewise, if catabolic exceeds anabolic, then I will be burning. If catabolic, I'll be gaining weight. Does that make sense? I got to start all over again. I messed up. So if you have anabolic exceeds catabolic, you're going to be gaining structure, okay? Possibly gaining weight. But if the catabolic exceeds the anabolic, losing, okay? And so what happens is growth hormone shifts your metabolic activity, okay? In such manner that anabolic reactions exceed the catabolic reactions, and the result is growth occurs. You guys see? Okay. Very good. All right. Okay, next are the tropic hormones. So I think what I'm going to do is give you guys a quick break. Is that all right? Okay, do a quick break. Some of you guys are looking at the clock now, and that's usually a sign that it's time to break.
Do you know what? Never mind.